Well, on my way to the dealership to go drop off the 2016 Chevy Colorado. I have one last video basically to talk about a couple of the things that I did have issues with. One of those was actually during the winter this year. We had some very cold temperatures. I think it was down to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and I happened to drive this down towards Detroit, and I ended up with the DEF diesel exhaust fluid light coming on, and it turned out that the DEF fluid actually froze. I probably hadn't driven it for a while, so my thought was that normally this thing is supposed to pull the DEF fluid back into the tank, and it's got a tank heater so that it's able to then run it back out once it's warm and inject it into the exhaust stream and keep the emission system working the way that it's supposed to. But it turns out I hadn't driven it for a while, so maybe it didn't do that, and the stuff was frozen somewhere, and I actually ended up buying a version of a tuner to be able to see if I could actually reset it on my own. Turns out the way to fix frozen DEF is to basically take the truck and stick it inside of a garage, which I stuck it in my attached garage, which ends up being somewhere in the 50-degree range most of the winter time. Froze back out, drove it, took it on the road, and after a couple of miles it checked itself and everything was good and ended up and working just fine. Now on this truck, and even the new truck is going to have this too, but your DEF filler is actually right here with the fuel tank, and the new truck actually doesn't have a fuel cap on it, so it's a capless fuel system, which I'm not sure how happy I am about, but it is as it is. You'll notice that the actual DEF, if you end up overfilling your tank, which I have done, not intentionally, but whether it's just from expansion or whatever, you'll notice that there's some crust there, which is actually the urea coming out of the fluid and then drying. So there's a little bit of white stuff there in the cap. My suggestion is, if you're going to fill it, definitely don't top off the DEF tank ever. And if you end up filling it, make sure that you end up driving it fairly quickly after you filled it. I know there's some thermal expansion of that fluid, but anyways, that's one of the things that, especially not having a nice cap to cover up the diesel tank, we'll see how the new truck actually does. So that was one thing that I had an issue with. The other thing is, when I actually first had bought this, I ended up with a problem with some of the wiring inside of the truck, and the dealership there, Al Serra, actually had the truck for almost a month. I had two Chevy Silverados that I drove while this was in there, and they ended up having to change out the main wiring harness. Now, basically, I had talked to the dealership and I said, it's their opportunity to make sure that the truck was as good as it was when it first came out of the factory, and it turns out it was. No issues whatsoever after they had finally gotten approval to replace the main body wiring harness. So they had part of the interior taken out, and anyways, that was kind of disturbing in the beginning, but they took care of it, and the truck has been rock solid ever since then. Now, there are two other known, I won't even call them issues, but there's two other known things with this truck. The first one is, depending on the temperature, there's actually a plastic bracket up underneath the fender in this area here that bridges, and when it's warm out and you go over some bumps every once in a while, you'll hear a little bit of a clicking sound. It turns out it's not the suspension, it's just that piece of plastic that's back up over the fender well there. There's some other YouTube videos that talk about how to take care of that. And then there's one other thing. The ECU for this truck is actually mounted on the firewall in front of the passenger side over here. And that guy at certain RPMs will rattle. There's not really foam or anything behind it to help take up any of the space. I mean, depending on the temperature again and depending on the engine RPM, you will end up with a little bit of a rattle. Other than that, I really can't say anything bad about this truck. Little minor production issue, which it was one of the first trucks that came off the line with the diesel engine. But the overall, it's been pretty good. The one other thing that I've been keeping an eye on, I do have, if anybody's interested, I do have oil analysis, and basically the oil analysis still comes back good. The truck does use about a quart of oil. Actually, it consumes it. I won't say uses it. Nothing comes out the tailpipe. You have no idea where it's going. Oil looks really good. The oil analysis all comes back very good. But it will, at 50% on the oil monitor, I do end up putting in another quart. And then basically by the time I get down to close to 0%, because it turns out the oil analysis guys say I can go even farther. But I end up needing to put in another quart. So in approximately 8,000 miles, it will use 2 quarts of oil. Maybe because of all the towing that I've done, I have approximately probably close to 5,000 miles of towing out of the 57,000 miles that are actually on the truck. But in general, that really doesn't concern me, because again, I've been doing oil analysis, and it would be nice if it didn't use any oil at all. My other diesels that I've got don't use any oil, so we'll see how the new one does. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I will keep everybody posted on how the new 2020 Silverado is doing in the future. So this is the final, I'm getting ready to turn the truck in. This is the final mileage. So you can see this is an average over the last 450 miles. Towing my trailer most of the time I got 13.8, but my best was 13.33. and then if we switch over to some of the other menus, within a 50-mile stretch I actually ended up at one point in time at 40.6, and in a smaller 25-mile stretch it was 42 miles per gallon. So hoping that when we end up with the new truck that I can beat these numbers. Yeah, so this is the end. 57,549 are the number of miles that I've put on the Colorado, and hopefully the Silverado does me just as well, if not better.